Okay, everybody, hello. Thank you very much for being here at this session. I gotta admit, I feel really bad about speaking right during the break time, but I'll try to put us back on track. What are we going to talk about today? Today we're going to talk about introduction to DevOps, specifically putting DevOps testing into practice. But first, let's talk about what DevOps means. Like, what do we mean by DevOps? Like Agile, I found that DevOps basically means different things to different companies. There's little agreement on what DevOps is. In fact, there's even no agreement on how it's spelled. Do you spell it DevOps or DevOps? At least with Agile, we know how it's spelled. But what do we mean by DevOps? Let's do a brief introduction. For our purposes, we will define DevOps like this. Putting together development and operations into a mutually supporting system that continually integrates code for new features as well as improvements into older features. So basically, we take development and operations and kind of put them together and let them work together. Like Agile, like I said, many companies develop software however they want and refer it to Agile. Basically, a lot of companies I've noticed that I've worked with basically just kind of do it, just kind of develop and just simply call it Agile. And many are even completely unfamiliar with the Agile Manifesto. If you've never seen this, have a look. You'll find it very interesting. And like Agile, the definition of DevOps, like I said, is so varied and amorphous that many organizations refer to whatever they're doing basically as DevOps. So let's actually have a plan when it comes to DevOps and putting testing into a good DevOps practice. What are the main DevOps philosophies? To kind of boil it down to make everything as simple as possible, basically means, automate everything, including tests. And even more so, we need to break down previously siloed activities. DevOps is kind of putting everybody onto the same page and all activities onto the same page. And so let's talk about a little, pre-DevOps, before DevOps, what other companies do instead of DevOps. They're basically siloed activities. And you're familiar with these: planning, development, build, testing, deployment, and then operations and monitoring are basically activities that were considered separate, done by separate teams, done by individual personnel that are specialized in just these activities. And so everything is separate. There's separate teams, separate functions, basically separate everything. But when it comes to DevOps, we kind of take everybody and sort of have them work together. And this is like a quick plan of what DevOps really looks like. It's a continuum instead of like the waterfall concept. Even Agile teams often follow a kind of waterfall. But here we have like a continuum. It's like a flow, and you can see the direction of the flow. And so in this flow, as we'll have a look at again, where do you start? With the waterfall and with Agile, there's a good place to start with planning. Here, a good thing about DevOps is you can start anywhere. So no matter what kind of project you're thrown in, if it's from the very beginning, if you're tasked to create a new application, a new website, whatever it might be, you can begin where it says the plan stage. Often, like I have been thrown into basically a failing system, a failing development plan, basically into a system that's failing. You can even start at one end or the other. I've started actually one end all the way at the operate and monitor stage. So you monitor what's happening, and from the monitoring what's happening, then you can proceed to plan and flow. So again, where do we start in this DevOps continuum? You can start anywhere, like I said, depending on the needs of the project and the needs of the system under development, under test. The suggested place to start, where it says plan. You see where plan is at the bottom. It's underneath release, and this is a good starting point where you can just start planning everything. Everything really should begin with a plan of some kind after you observe the system and see where you are. In our previous image, plan was at the bottom, and we can see that we've seen this as a good jumping point. And again, I want to reiterate that DevOps is a constant flow instead of a stop and start milestone-centered activity. You have to jump in anywhere, so plan is as a comfortable point as any. And again, keep in mind that you don't have to even begin with plan. You can make a starting point wherever that may suit the project at that particular time. In other words, start wherever the project can get the most benefit. And when we think of waterfall versus DevOps, if it helps, if many people I've noticed are still stuck in a kind of waterfall stage, we can think of DevOps waterfall as this MC Escher type waterfall, where yes, you can jump in anywhere and follow the flow of the water to where it finally ends at the top and goes to the bottom, and then once again, mine flows its way to the top again. And when we talk about testing, where does testing fit in here? There is an area where, well, like plan is at the center of the activity. You plan, and then you're constantly going from development into testing without really the over-the-wall philosophy. Where I began in software testing a long time ago at Nokia in Finland, testing consisted of literally like 40 testers in one room, all testing a certain area, a certain feature. And that's where we weren't even allowed to talk to the developers. We didn't even know the developers. In fact, the developers were even on a different continent than we were. But here, development and testing are working together and constantly planning on what to develop, how to test it, and then constantly improving that process. And so let's start with planning quickly. Yes, first we start off with the business requirements. In the planning stage, business requirements are composed, refined, agreed on, and approved by all parties involved. The features are put into scope, and yes, this is what gets developed and tested. And you'll see that I'm going to approach this from a very behavior-driven development standpoint, because that's basically what we're doing right now in the company that I'm working for. And we have to prevent scope creep as much as we can. In terms of the business requirements, the quality assurance is involved already in this stage in the business requirements. We can start with document review. I asked the question, can you already spot bugs at this stage during the document review? And we also at this point start with knowledge base creation. The idea behind this, and I want to ask a question of all you. Think about this. Quality, I was told this once, quality assurance must know the system under test or under development specifically better than anyone in the project. Think about that. Does or should quality assurance know the system better than everyone? I'm biased, but I think yes. Let's talk briefly about the pipeline. The tests are run in a feature or any branch, depending on the project that you're going on, in a staging environment or prod environment for regression suites. And you get immediate results regarding feature or design pass or fails, and to verify if the business requirements are being met. Now let's talk a little bit about the traditional legacy test automation. I won't really dwell on this since both Max and Anais talked about this very well already. But often when we come into a project as test automation people, the developers, the development leads, development managers, project managers will often criticize test automation for creating brittle scripts that often fail and give false readings. As we also talked, slow end-to-end regression suites end up concentrating on areas of minimal importance while running cursory tests on more important areas, and even more importantly, business requirement goals. I've seen too many test automation suites that basically concentrate, for example, on on the placement of the OK versus the cancel buttons, and basically ignore about what the feature, about what the system is supposed to do. And for that reason, these brittle scripts end up failing, and we end up losing a lot of time chasing false positives. And also, as I briefly touched upon, I know we're here to talk about test automation, but I honestly think that manual functional testing, the test automation can't keep pace with the increasingly complex modern applications and system development. And so this often ignores the higher level business requirements as agreed at the project's inception. So we're having trouble keeping pace with the very fast development systems that we're coming across today. And so this leads me to the point of, what I call the horrible truth. Quality assurance can't slow down the delivery process anymore for testing. In other words, we can't, the project anymore really can't stop for testing. And the thing we have to keep in mind that we are not the bottleneck. We can't be the bottleneck. To me, if you're going to avoid testing because testing is the bottleneck, you come across an even bigger bottleneck, which is the 30-day bug fix phase, where but the whole system has to be stopped, taken down, and continually fixed in production, which is a very time-consuming and very expensive process. Not only that, but it's a very humiliating process that makes the business look bad. So you're much better off investing time in quality assurance and testing than fixing bugs in production. But how do we do this? There is a way where we can provide very fast feedback about the system quality while keeping pace with the system of delivery. And that is putting development and testing in the same loop. Yes, call this test-driven development. You can take the business requirements and develop tests from those. And while development progresses, the development can create the features can then be tested, and then the features can pass the tests. So we're not behind, we're actually ahead of the system. And so we do some simple math here. We talk about continuous testing for our next point. And this is the other side, or part of continuous integration, which is continuous development plus continuous testing. We won't be so concerned about the details of continuous development here, because we're here to talk about testing, especially test automation. And here at a high level, continuous testing involves test early, test often, test everywhere, test rapidly, and test automated. And keeping in mind with the DevOps philosophy, this isn't a hierarchy. All of the above points are equally valid and important, and you can jump in anywhere, wherever the most value will be provided. And yes, before we move forward, Anna talked about this again. We can discuss one matter often overlooked in DevOps continuous testing and often in test automation, and that is the importance in manual functional testing. We can ask ourselves, does this have a place in the DevOps world? And I say yes. This area is often overlooked because DevOps is written, that I found, by developers or project managers who always tried to speed through or even bypass functional testing. And as I've said, with my experience, the over-the-wall testing by a large room full of manual testers is basically going. Again, depending on the companies, but we have to test faster. We have to keep up with the speed of testing so we can develop very fast run test suites while the development process is going on. And keeping in mind with that, we also have to keep in mind that test automation cannot find everything. Verification and insertion points have to be written in advance. So you have to find the bugs somehow. And again, no test automation writer can foresee all the things that can go wrong in any system. That's a problem with test automation when you're looking for things in advance and you can't foresee things that have gone wrong. And all of us as testers have seen very weird things go wrong in testing systems. And a valid criticism of test automation, a large amount of time, effort, and of course money is spent with not many bugs being found. I've known some very good, very talented test automation people who basically just don't find very many bugs. And I think as testers, as quality assurance people, our job is, yes, to provide as much information about the system as possible, but we also have to be able to find bugs, find problems, find issues, however your company defines them. And again, we don't have test automation just to have test automation. I found too many automated tests are easy, happy path. They're basically just designed to pass. A lot of development managers, development people say, look at all of these green lights here. Our system must be stable because look how many of these tests are passing. In my opinion, a good test finds bugs. A good test doesn't just pass. So yes, green lights must indicate that the system has been skillfully developed, stable, and free of issues, right? That's basically like the happy path, basically a panacea, basically a system that really doesn't exist. Our job is to find bugs and to find problems and to give information about those problems wherever they may exist. And as such, exploratory testing is needed in DevOps. As we've said, we've talked about this briefly a few presentations ago. Charters, exploratory testing based on charters, which is a kind of a loose plan on where you test. I know you said that exploratory testing isn't just clicking and clicking and clicking and clicking. You have to have at least some kind of plan where you're going to test, for how long, and what you're looking for. And this quick and easy rapid exploratory testing can find obvious bugs that test automation scripts by themselves can't. So you use both in tandem, exploratory testing and test automation. And those will provide deeper levels of testing and can verify and validate our business requirements. Okay, going on quickly for our documentation review. This is as early as possible as you can test. QA can find issues even in the early documentation process, and you can start planning, creating initial tests, and try to know the system better than anyone in this documentation phase. I'll briefly touch on unit tests, because again, we've seen in diagrams of how unit testing should comprise like the majority of the tests, like at the bottom of the pyramid. Unit tests can be created and executed by QA as well as developers. Code isn't just a private property of just the developers, especially if you're using a system like Git or really any kind of system like that. QA can jump in and write unit tests. I've even written an article about this. And tests can be written in advance with the test-driven development approach in mind. We can do that in terms of unit tests and also in terms of functional automated tests. And all of this, again, is part of the position leveling concept and breaking down of walls and silos. Yeah, test early. QA should, is now involved. It also depends on your company. I'm actually fighting for this still. Because a lot of developers, a lot of development managers and project managers still have the idea that a system has to be ready for testing. In this view, in DevOps, the system is always ready for testing. The system is always tested by everybody. We've heard again this morning that quality is not just the job of the quality assurance team and testers. Quality should be a concern of everybody. And that can be as early as possible. So test plans, scenarios, conditions, scripts, everything, no matter what you do, what your company wants you to do as your plan, from your plan as testers, you can do all of this as early as possible. Tests can be executed early in development phase, and tests are based on already defined scenarios instead of developed and built applications. So from those scenarios that are based on the business requirements, you can start developing tests and not just wait for the system to be quote unquote ready for testing. And this is, again, emphasized here. The whole idea of not ready for testing no longer applies. Everything is ready for testing. The system is always ready for testing. If there are approved and, of course, written business requirements, then tests can be written and even executed. Sure, they'll fail until the feature is developed, built, and passes. And again, tests often create multiple unit and functional tests. It all depends on numbers. there's sort of an idea that the more tests, the better. That may not be the case always, because I've been in too many projects where testing or developers who've written their own test automation suites will simply basically copy over tests that test basically the same thing on the same kind of happy path that will reveal a lot of past tests, but not really tell the truth about the stability of the system. Tests must verify and assert business requirements in a way that is convincing to the client. In other words, you're testing and providing quality assurance really to make the client happy. You want to make the end users happy and not really just the development manager happy. And so there are no more happy path tests to please the client or to please development managers or the developers or the project managers. And you also have to know your pipelines, which can require unit and functional tests. This morning, we've been talking a lot about Jenkins. I have used Jenkins in the past, but now, for example, we're using GitLab CI. So we can't speak specifically about pipelines. It's just whatever system your project is doing. Again, test oversight. The test execution is not necessarily just the important part. You have to really look at your results, examine your results. Don't just look at the green lights that say, wow, look at all of these past tests. What have you been testing? What is your test doing? What is your test looking for? What is your test trying to do? And I heard this once and really believe it. Test maintenance is just as important as test creation. Just creating large numbers of tests that often become brittle and will eventually fail and lead to many lost positives, which will lead to lost time and give basically fodder to the whole idea that test automation isn't worth the investment. You have to really maintain your tests, change them as the system's changing, make sure that they find what they're supposed to find. In other words, that their assertions and validations really catch what they're looking for. And review, just constantly review. Review is just as important as execution. And again, test everywhere. Now, how do we define successful test automation? You're verifying the actual business requirements. Bugs are found and bugs are fixed. In my experience, and I will stress this, a good test finds bugs. A good test doesn't prove that everything works, quote unquote. A good test will find issues, find problems, find bugs. And then I have to say this, you can agree or disagree, we can discuss this. The main difference between developer-created test automation versus QA test automation is that we see finding bugs as good, but they do not. We'll talk about that. Now, just in conclusion, to try to get us back on track in terms of time, create tests early and often, and run them often in the pipeline, and review. I should have put review. Send results to operations. Don't just talk with developers, lead developers, development managers, project managers. Talk to the operations people. They're just involved in the system as you are, and they should be just as interested in your results as you are. Ask them what can be good ideas to create more tests. And keep testing in line with development. As development progresses, testing should progress. If not, just come out a little farther ahead. And so know your system and develop tests in parallel with development. Please feel free to email me about anything, dasco2200@gmail.com, or on Twitter, @dasco. I'm very happy to talk about this. And otherwise, I can actually give my discussion time over to Roberto if we're short on time. That'll be it for me for today. Thank you very much and have a great day.